Yeah, so I just want to pivot to
Yeah,
now your paper, Promising by Right. I read it
yeah,
shortly after the course, and it
yeah.
was
I'm very
really,
flattered.
really well written and such a good
Oh,
read.
thank you.
And so your title of the paper was Promising by Right. So could you
Yeah.
just elaborate for me on how you arrived to this title?
Um,
There's any,
I'm 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 grinning because I was just going through this. My papers tend to go through a lot of title changes, and partly this just reflects something I've learned to accept about my own process as a philosophical writer. I think there are some people, and I very much, in some moods, find myself envious of these people who start out with an incredibly clear understanding of what it is that they want to say in a philosophy paper, what claim it is that they want to establish, and how exactly they want to establish that claim. And they're able to sort of have the entire architecture of their paper kind of in their mind, and then sit down at their word processor and it kind of comes out. For me, I start out writing a paper. I think the paper is going to be about one thing, and by the time the paper is finally in its finished form, or anyway its published form, that's not always the same thing. um, it's obviously very much about connected themes and whatnot, but it often is doing something quite different than what I might have envisaged it as doing when I first started. So the actual answer to your question is that the paper you read went through a number of different title changes as the paper was written, and where I ended up landing was on this idea that this thing that Nietzsche observes about the way we make promises, namely that it's not just a kind of an ability that we happen to have, that we're able to exercise in the way in which we're able to, I don't know, jog or speak a language or something like that, but that instead um, promising is itself the sort of thing that we um, in most instances claim to be entitled to do by virtue of our having a kind of standing among our social fellows that we insist they recognize as people who can give their word. That this was really an important idea, important to anybody who kind of wants to think about how promising works and why it matters and what it is to be good at it, and how you can kind of mess it up in various ways. And that other philosophers weren't really talking about this at all, that in fact, their way of thinking about promises not only ignored it, but in some ways um, really depended on thinking the opposite, that this was not a big part of how our actual promising goes. That when I give you my word, I'm not just kind of throwing it out there for you to take it or leave it most of the time, but I'm saying, no, Clarence, take it from me. I'll be there, and you need to take it from me at the risk of instead telling me that I'm kind of not a grown up who can give you his word on matters like this. You now have this choice, like, well, okay, am I gonna take it from you? And if I if I don't take it from you, I'm in effect, kind of telling you, you're not really a person of your word who I'm prepared to trust just because you say you're going to do something. I need collateral. I need other forms of assurance, and that really matters. I think so. That's the story behind it and how I ended up with that title.
really,
Yeah,
yeah, that's really interesting because I feel like that's sort of the way, like I've done a few like essay competitions for philosophy and like I do philosophy, like I have philosophy classes at school. And I feel like oftentimes when I'm just writing just an essay like that doesn't have a time limit on it, I don't really have I have a certain idea in mind and it often turns out just completely different because I
yeah,
start like working through the weeds and like walking through all like the steps or the points that I'm trying to make, and then realizing, oh, this I'm kind of more convinced by this position, or like going a different way. That's really interesting.
I
Yeah.
think
So
this is great. I mean, I think I learn through the activity of writing. I learn through lots of other, I mean, I learn a lot from talking philosophy with other people, and I learn a lot from teaching philosophy. Um, I think for some people, I don't know how many, the as I said, the writing process works a little differently. But for me, I mean, it can be frustrating and torturous because you kind of, hit these walls or find yourself at sea at various points, and you think, oh my God, this idea that I thought I had is kind of slipping through my fingers, and maybe there's no good thing to say here at all. But then you kind of catch yourself and recover yourself. And in the end, I think for me, this is also why writing philosophy turns out to be worthwhile and rewarding, because figure stuff out through the activity of writing, and then at the end of it, hopefully I'm able to share something of what I figured out with other people. And yeah.
that's really cool. So actually, at the start of your essay, I really like the anecdote of your grandfather because I feel
Yeah.
like it really frames Nietzsche's perspective of a person who had the right to make promises. So on this idea, could you just tell me more broadly how you think personal narratives and like experiences shape your philosophical arguments and thoughts? Like for me, when I do,
Yeah.
I feel like I think more in the abstract and then I use my life experiences to frame it in a more understandable way. So I just want to know
Yeah.
how it works for you.
Yeah. I think for me, I mean, in a way, this kind of circles back a little bit to some of our earlier conversation about the existentialists and about how I think about um, at least, you know, philosophical work on ethics or on morality. I think there's, great variety in philosophy, and I'm totally a pluralist about this. And I think for many people, the things that excite them most in philosophy are precisely those things that involve an extremely um, detached and kind of theoretical interest. And I can totally get it. I mean, I have my share of days where I spend hours thinking about Locke's inverted spectrum problem or something like that, and it's great. I mean, it's totally great. It's intellectually stimulating and it's fun, and you really feel like you're grappling with deep and important questions about things. Um, I think in ethics, in moral and political philosophy, the the starting point for me is just from the outset more personal. I mean, I'm kind of engaging in the activity because I want to figure out how I'm going to live my life, and answering that question by doing some philosophy seems to me the best and in some sense the only way to go about it. And so if I didn't sort of start with questions that seemed to me um, live for me in the sense of, kind of arising within the life that I'm in the process of living, I would be, kind of doing something quite different than what I'm in fact doing. And so in that sense, I think questions about personal experience are key. They're kind of like, where I start and what I ultimately feel responsible to in making philosophical arguments, setting forward philosophical ideas. If they're not actually ones that I think would be of some help or some use to somebody who's kind of trying to figure out, well, what what's being a good promiser all about, and what's so important about being a person of your word, and questions like that, then in a way I feel like I've kind of missed the point of the activity. um there's a somewhat distinct question of, well, so then what do you want to do with these kind of bits of, as you said, personal narrative or anecdote? um and do you want to include them in your writing? And I start that paper, as you say, with with a a bit of kind of remembrance of my grandfather, which, by the way, is actually quite accurate. Uh, my grandfather was a complicated guy in lots of ways, but one thing that was central to his own conception of who he was, and that indeed I think he succeeded in living up to. If you had asked other people who knew him and interacted with him, this would have been one of the first things they said about him, is that he lived by his word in all things, and he had this kind of existence where he could there were sort of family stories about how he could walk into the local car dealership and walk out with a new car and an agreement to be making payments on the car to the dealership with no paperwork, without ever signing anything, right? Because he was who he was, and people knew him, and they knew he was going to be good for the money. And nowadays that possibility is just not really a live one for most people, at least in the case of buying a car. But there are other ways where you can try to establish these kinds of relationships. And one of the questions that's kind of driving that paper is, well, is that good? Do we want that? And should we be on the lookout for more of those opportunities? And should we be concerned about the degree to which those opportunities seem to be diminishing in our social world as we move towards more mediated ways of interacting with one another? I guess I think the value of including these kinds of personal narratives in writing, and to some extent also in conversation or in teaching, is that I really think of philosophy and philosophical writing, especially as a kind of interpersonal interaction. That is, when I'm writing a piece of philosophy, I want the people who are reading that piece of philosophy to be connecting with me, the author. That's again, maybe I mean, I don't want to say that it's a controversial opinion, but there's another model for thinking about philosophy. Maybe it's a little bit more the model of math or science, although I think the kind of scientific writing that people who are kind of popularizers of science do is actually much more personal. But you could imagine a kind of aspiration to write philosophy where you said, look, what I want to try to do is point my reader to these abstract ideas and just kind of get out of the way as a human being. I want my reader to be able to kind of forge this connection to the arguments and the reasons for the claims. And my role is to kind of facilitate that relationship between the reader and the ideas. And the best way to do that is to kind of efface all aspects of my personality and my biography and all that stuff. I just don't find that model appealing. I don't like reading philosophy like that for the most part. The philosophers whose work I like to read the most, it's often because I have a real sense of who the other embodied human being with a real set of experiences and a real life of their own was on the other end of the philosophy. And I feel kind of connected to that person, and that person is, is there telling me things and teaching me things. And, even if the person has been dead for 300 years or is someone who I've never had the pleasure of meeting, even if we're contemporaries, I feel like, oh, I know her. I'm learning from them. I'm interacting with them. And so when I write, I kind of want to do the same thing. I want people to read my papers and feel like they're learning something from me. They might disagree with me. They might think I'm totally nutty for the things that I'm claiming, but I want them to think I'm totally nutty. And so a big part of my my work when I'm writing papers is to try to kind of put myself in them in that sense, in the form of, whether it's always anecdotes about me or my family, or even just aspects of style or the way in which I try to write. I don't want people to to get to the end of my paper and feel like that could have been written by anybody, or who wrote that paper. Who knows? That's not what matters. I want them in a way to kind of be feeling the opposite. I want them to think, I want to know who that character was, who told me all those things, because I think he's deeply right about something, or I think he's deeply wrong about something, but he'd be worth arguing with about it. So anyway, there you go.
Yeah, I think that really personal aspect really came through, and I felt like it was very, at least the personal aspects I got from the paper sort of
Yeah, thanks.
was in line with, I guess, when I was in your class and in person. So I think it really came through. So at the start of this, you talked about how the right to make promises doesn't really register in discussions among some moral philosophers, and that a lot of focus is rather on, for example, like moral obligations. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I can give you a kind of quasi-historical answer in the form of, a few key papers, figures in the history of philosophy who sort of seem to be responsible for shifting focus to that question. But that, in a way, is a kind of shallow explanation. The deeper question is, well, but why? Like, why would those papers have gripped people's attention and imagination such that philosophers would, by and large, spend a lot of time worrying about this part of the activity and not so much about other parts? The the hunch that I have is that this is connected to a kind of prevalent deficiency in at least some moral philosophy nowadays. So one of my heroes in philosophy, who you heard a lot about in the course, Bernard Williams, he wrote in the introduction to a book about moral philosophy that he wrote in the 70s, that he thought that, I'm paraphrasing here, but that kind of doing moral philosophy the right way ought to be dangerous. It ought to be dangerous for two reasons. That one, you were always in danger of kind of showing yourself up to be a fool. you could manage to say some pretty dumb things that would kind of reveal the limitations of your own moral consciousness or moral personality. And two, that if you were talking about serious things and it turned out that you said things that were wrong, even if they weren't stupidly wrong, you might actually manage to persuade people to make some mistakes in their lives. And that's a pretty dangerous thing to do, actually, when you think about it, right? I mean, I suppose it's a kind of risk that parents run all the time with their own children, but for the most part, most of us don't spend our time thinking about the ways in which we might manage to derail somebody else's life. But if you're doing moral philosophy well and you manage to be persuasive and convincing, and yet your ideas turn out to be wrongheaded, that's dangerous. I'm really taken with that criticism about moral philosophy. That is the criticism that Williams makes, that though moral philosophy should be dangerous in these ways, a lot of the culture of the profession, at least right now, is very risk averse. That it actually seems to steer itself away from these dangers and find ways of posing problems, asking questions, and trying to argue about the answers that really isn't that risky, that fairly little turns out to hang on. And whether or not it even succeeds in doing that, I mean, I actually think if you lived your life as a promiser in a way that showed a kind of substantial incorporation into your own moral thinking of the things that a lot of moral philosophers end up saying about promising, you'd actually be a pretty lousy person. So in the end, actually, they do manage to say some pretty dangerous things, but the thing that saves them is that nobody really pays that much attention and actually does the things that they say. Even the moral philosophers themselves. Actually, I think a lot of people who write about these topics probably don't really live in the way that their own view or their own emphasis of thinking about the idea would imply that they should. So I think a lot of it, in a way, has to do with factors like that. That it's sort of safe to say, okay, yeah, we all know what moral obligation is all about. Of course, we don't all know that, far from it, and we all know that the point of making a promise is to generate an obligation. We know what those are, and we know that making promises is a way for making those. And now let's have a really lively philosophical dispute about exactly how. Right? How could it be that just saying some words, I get a new obligation? Ordinarily, in order to find myself with a new obligation, I have to do something more than just assert, let me hereby have an obligation. I back over your mailbox as I'm leaving my driveway, and now I have an obligation to repair the mailbox or buy you a new one. Or again, I decide to take a new job and sign the papers for the position, and now I'm put in a position where other people are depending on me, and because they're depending on me, I now have obligations to them. Right? So we have real changes in the world, including the kind of dependence of these new people, and now I have obligations. And philosophers have sort of thought, well, promising is kind of funny. It doesn't work that way. I just say I have an obligation, and then I have an obligation. How could that be? And so I can sort of see how this is a very appealing kind of question to think about, especially if, like me, you're sort of suspicious that the questions that would be especially attractive are often the ones that do prove to be safe, to avoid the dangers of saying things that would shake up the way that people actually do that. I think, actually, if you're persuaded by the arguments in my paper promising, it probably should change the way in which you think about making promises. You should be a little bit more circumspect in how you give your word, and whose word you're willing to take, and about what, and about when you don't give your word and instead ask for other kinds of collateral and security. And I could be wrong about that. And if I am wrong about that, I'm leading people astray if anybody is actually convinced. So yeah.
I'm just going to go into one last question, which I feel like we've
Sure.
sort of touched on here and there. So this is a very broad question, but sort of, I guess, in the modern day, there's been a pretty big shift, I feel like, towards science and I guess empirical based fields. So I wanted to ask whether you think philosophy has any relevance in the modern age, and if so, what the relevance and the utility of it as a field of study is.
Yeah, I mean, this is you're right. In an interview with a lot of really big questions, this is an even bigger one than some of the others. So I think I think there's an important distinction probably to be drawn between science and a kind of scientism, and other people are better at drawing this distinction than I am, and then emphasizing the importance of science and also the dangers of a kind of scientism. Among the things that I suppose I mean in using the term scientism, which I think is and ought to be a kind of a term of abuse. You do not want to be a scientistic kind of person. Is in a way thinking that sort of the form of knowing and understanding and figuring out that that is typical of science is in fact the only viable or legitimate form of knowing and understanding and figuring out. And I'm very much of the view that that there are lots of different forms of knowing and understanding and figuring out, and at least the part of philosophy that I spend a lot of time working within is very much humanistic rather than scientistic. That is, it's a field that sort of starts not with the idea that knowledge is to be gained by transcending idiosyncratic features of the human world, and sort of saying, okay, supposing we were able to abstract entirely from our ways of perceiving the world or our ways of making sense of things, and instead could kind of figure out how the world in itself operates. It just starts within the human world and never has really the aspiration to leave it behind. I think those kinds of questions and the answers of people who are kind of unapologetically interested in these kinds of humanistic questions are deeply important, and I will say it's a bad thing that that at least some people seem increasingly to doubt the importance of those questions. There's lots of ways in which maybe humanists have not helped themselves in the recent and maybe even not so recent history of the academy. And there's lots to say about that. We don't always make the affirmative case on behalf of our way of being academics or being scholars and having important things to say that people should listen to. We sometimes seem to operate from a position of insecurity or a kind of defensive crouch. There's also lots of things to say about the recent history, and by recent I mean the last 100+ years of philosophy in the academy, and a kind of crisis that beset philosophers in the 20th century, to which many of them responded by trying to make philosophy at least more like a science, because they thought science was respectable and credentialed in a way in which philosophy at that time really didn't seem to be. And in a way, the criticisms of some of the philosophy that they were reacting to were probably apt, but their solution, in my estimation, was in the end counterproductive and unhelpful, or anyway, the pendulum swung too far and it has become counterproductive and unhelpful. I think the only solution to this problem, if it's going to be solved, and I think there's it's anybody's guess whether it will, is more humanistic work. I think I suppose the thought is something like, these are important kinds of questions which people want answers to, and they're going to get answers from somewhere. And if philosophers are not giving them good answers that they can understand and use and apply to their own lives in ways that they feel are meaningful and helpful, they're going to get answers from somewhere else. And at least according to me, and hopefully according to the other philosophers, those answers will tend not to be as good. They won't be as reflective. They won't be as well supported by the kind of characteristic modes and methods of self-critical reflective argument that philosophers traffic in, and so philosophy has to kind of make its case as a unapologetically humanistic uh, contribution to the social world, and hasn't been doing a very good job of that lately. And that might explain why, uh, you know, uh, maybe as a whole, the culture is more taken with science and more scientific in how it thinks about things. More. You mentioned empiricism. I think that's truly connected to this, but I've been artfully dodging the question of the degree to which a kind of empiricism is also endemic in our culture, in part because I think that's also a really hard question. And in some ways, I have some sympathy for certain kinds of empiricist impulses, though I think they hit a wall pretty clearly at a certain point, and a certain kind of naive and flat-footed empiricism, particularly about the social world, actually is a pretty limited and impoverished way of approaching these things. So I think it's a hard question, and maybe the last thing I'll say about this is it may well be that people as old as me are not going to be the ones to really right the ship. It's gonna be your job to keep doing philosophy, and don't be too scientific about it. Avoid the pressure to think that that the only way to be serious and rigorous is to, I don't know, do computer science and engineering, and that philosophy is a kind of sideline, but an overall kind of softer business in that sense of hard and soft. It's not. It should be the subordinate of no other field of academic inquiry and debate. Yeah,
That was such a good answer. So I think it was pretty good to wrap up.
Thanks.
I just
want
want
a great question
for coming onto the podcast and dealing with very, I think, tough and long and challenging questions. So I really appreciate your time. I had a really amazing discussion.
Thank you so much, Clarence. This was an absolute joy. It was great to see you again, and all credit to you for coming up with such great and deep questions to ask. So I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.